"Sir, this is a bank, not a shelter." Lauren Parker's voice cut across the entire lobby, sharp and deliberate, loud enough to make sure everyone heard. She looked Jacob Turner up and down the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the quiet way he stood at her window, and she smiled like she'd already decided who he was. Laughter rippled through the room. A few people exchanged glances. Nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word in his defense. Jacob didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply reached into his pocket and made a phone call. That was all it took. Jacob Turner had never been the kind of man who needed people to know who he was. That wasn't modesty. It was something closer to a principle. He had watched enough men in expensive suits make decisions from a distance, never once setting foot in the places their names were attached to, never once understanding what those places actually felt like from the inside. He had decided early on that he would not become that kind of man. So he didn't. He wore the same rotation of plain clothes he'd worn for years, dark trousers, simple shirts, and a jacket that had seen better decades. His watch was functional, not decorative. He drove himself when he could eat at diners when he was traveling, and handled certain matters personally when he believed the matter was worth handling personally. Most people who encountered him in passing assumed he was a retired schoolteacher or maybe a mid-level contractor between jobs. He never corrected them. There was no reason to. His wife Claire had been the same way. She had grown up without money and never quite trusted the version of herself that had it not because she was ashamed of what they'd built, but because she believed that comfort had a way of narrowing a person's vision if they let it. She used to say that the moment you stopped being able to imagine what it felt like to need something, you lost the most important thing a person in their position could have. Jacob had thought about that often in the 3 years since she died. He thought about it again, now standing on the sidewalk outside a glass-fronted building on North Michigan Avenue, about to walk through the door. The thing that brought him to the Meridian Bank branch that Thursday morning was not routine. For the past several weeks, his financial oversight team had flagged a cluster of internal irregularities tied to this specific branch transaction records that didn't align, processing delays that had no clear explanation, and a pattern of customer complaint filings that had been quietly closed without resolution. None of it was dramatic on its own, but patterns had a way of meaning something, and Jacob had learned long ago to take them seriously. He wanted to see the branch himself without announcement, without preparation, the way it actually ran on an ordinary morning. He arrived just after 9 o'clock when the lobby was moderately busy. He wore the same jacket, the one with the slightly frayed left shoulder seam that he had never gotten around to replacing. He took a number from the dispenser near the entrance and stood in line like anyone else. The Meridian branch on North Michigan Avenue was one of the bank's mid-tier Chicago locations, not the flagship downtown office, but not a small neighborhood branch either. It occupied the ground floor of a glass-fronted building with a polished marble floor, 3 rows of waiting chairs upholstered in gray fabric, and 6 teller windows along the far wall. 4 of those windows were staffed that morning. The space had the particular quality of a place that had been designed to look trustworthy and had mostly succeeded. Rebecca Collins had managed this branch for a little over 4 years. She ran a tight, visible operation. The lobby was always clean, the staff always dressed well, and the numbers the branch reported to regional headquarters were consistently acceptable. What didn't show up in those numbers, and what Rebecca had quietly allowed to take root over those 4 years, was a culture of internal sorting. Her staff had learned through a combination of her example and her silence that not all customers were worth the same level of effort. The ones who came in wearing good clothes, carrying name-brand bags, speaking with a certain kind of confidence, those customers got warmth, got patience, got proactive assistance. The others got the minimum. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. Lauren Parker was 27 and had worked at this branch for just under 2 years. She was efficient with paperwork and fast at processing standard transactions, and Rebecca had noted her for a possible supervisor track. Lauren had absorbed the culture of the branch, the way most people absorb the culture of wherever they spend 40 hours a week, gradually, without ever making a conscious decision about it. By the time Jacob Turner reached her window that morning, she had already formed a complete opinion of him based on the 40 seconds it took him to walk across the lobby. She looked at the jacket first, then the shoes, then the way he placed his hands on the counter. No rings, no portfolio, no visible markers of anything. She had a category for people like this, and she placed him in it immediately. "Next," she said, without looking up from her screen. Jacob told her he needed to review some transaction records on a specific account and requested to speak with someone in the account services department. It was a straightforward request. Lauren's eyes finally moved to his face, then back to her screen. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked, in the tone of someone who had already decided the answer was probably no. Jacob confirmed that he did and provided the account reference. Lauren typed, something, looked at the result, and her expression didn't change in any meaningful way. The account existed. That didn't seem to shift her opinion of the man standing in front of her. "Account services can't just see walk-ins," she said. "You'd need to schedule an appointment. There's a 2-week wait right now." Jacob told her calmly that the matter was time-sensitive and asked whether there was a manager available he could speak with instead. Lauren's response was immediate and delivered at a volume that was not strictly necessary for a one-on-one conversation. "Sir, this is a bank, not a shelter." She gestured briefly at his jacket, the way people gesture at something they find mildly distasteful. "If you can't make an appointment like everyone else, I'm not sure what you expect us to do for you." The laughter came quickly. A few customers nearby, a sound more reflexive than cruel, but laughter nonetheless. A younger male teller 2 windows down glanced over and said nothing. The security guard near the door looked at the floor. Nobody intervened. Jacob stood still. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shift his weight, didn't do any of the things a person does when they're deciding whether to escalate. He looked at Lauren Parker with an expression that gave away nothing, and he said simply that he would like to speak with the branch manager. Lauren's smile remained in place. "The branch manager is busy. I can leave her a note." The implication in her tone was that the note would accomplish nothing, and she knew it, and she expected him to know it too. What Jacob understood in that moment, standing at that window, with the marble floor reflecting the morning light behind him, and the faint sound of other transactions continuing around him as if nothing had happened, was that this was not a single bad employee having a bad morning. The security guard who had looked at the floor was not surprised. The teller 2 windows down had not flinched. The customers nearby who had laughed had done so easily, as if the scene had confirmed something they had already expected to see in a place like this. This had texture to it. This had the shape of something practiced. He asked Lauren one more time to notify the manager that a customer was requesting to speak with her. Lauren said she would pass it along. Her expression said she would not. Jacob stepped away from the window and found an empty chair along the far wall. He sat down, placed his hands on his knees, and looked at the lobby around him with the careful attention of someone who was no longer just observing someone who was now cataloging. He watched the way the staff at the other windows engaged with customers who came in wearing business attire versus the ones who came in wearing work clothes or older coats. He watched the body language shift, the speed of service change, the warmth appear and disappear, depending on who was standing at the counter. It was subtle enough that most people probably didn't notice it consciously, but it was consistent. Pattern after pattern after pattern. The question he had come to answer was no longer just about irregular transaction records. The question had become larger, and the answer was already beginning to take shape. He could have identified himself then. He had the documentation to do it, carried on his phone, and in a sealed envelope in the inside pocket of the jacket that Lauren Parker had mocked. He could have walked back to that window and laid everything on the counter and watched the expression on her face change in real time. Part of him noted that option, with the clarity of someone who knew exactly what it would look like. He didn't do it. What he chose instead was to stay in that chair and continue watching, because what he had seen in the last 20 minutes told him that revealing his identity now would solve the immediate problem and nothing else. Lauren Parker would be embarrassed. Rebecca Collins would appear and become suddenly very helpful. And in a week after he left, the lobby would return to exactly what it had been that morning. The customers who came in with old jackets and work-worn hands would continue to receive the minimum. The pattern would continue because the pattern had never been about one teller. At one window, it was about what the entire branch had decided was acceptable. If he was going to do this properly, he needed to see how deep it went. And that meant staying unremarkable for a little while longer, even if it cost him something to do it. He reached for his phone, not to make the call yet, but to send a message to his operations director, a man named David Harmon, who had been with the company for 11 years and understood what Jacob's messages that came without context usually meant. The message was 4 words: North Michigan. Start documentation. Harmon would know what to do with that. By the time Jacob finished sitting in this lobby, the first layer of the paper trail would already be forming on the 44th floor of a building 12 blocks north. Jacob put his phone back in his pocket and returned his attention to the lobby. Across the room, Lauren Parker was already serving the next customer, a man in a pressed gray suit who had walked directly to her window. She was smiling now, fully and warmly, leaning slightly forward, in the way that suggested genuine interest. She handed him a form with both hands. She explained something, and he nodded, and she laughed at something he said. Jacob watched this for a moment without expression. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not accidental. It was the operating logic of this branch made visible service as a reward for appearance withheld, as a judgment on those who didn't meet the standard. Claire had been right about what comfort did to people's vision. What he was looking at was the result of 4 years of no one correcting that drift. He made his decision. He was not going to leave. He was not going to announce himself, and he was not going to let this be the last time he walked into this building as an ordinary person, because he needed to understand, fully and without performance, what this place did to people who didn't have the option of revealing who they really were. Those people, the ones who came in with worn jackets and careful expressions and requests that were no less legitimate than anyone else's, they didn't have an envelope in their inside pocket. They didn't have a forward message they could send to change the trajectory of the entire afternoon. They just had to stand at that window and absorb whatever was handed to them, and then leave, and then come back another day and do it again. Jacob sat with that for a long moment. It wasn't the first time in his life he had thought about the difference between his situation and theirs. But it felt sharper today inside this specific building, under the particular quality of light that fell through those glass walls onto a marble floor that had been designed to make everyone feel like they were somewhere important. He was still sitting in that chair when a woman walked past the waiting area with a stack of folders tucked under her arm and a lanyard that identified her as branch staff. She glanced at him briefly, the way staff glance at waiting customers, assessing whether he was a problem, deciding he wasn't, and moving on. She didn't offer assistance. She didn't acknowledge that he might have been waiting for something. He noted this without reacting to it. The lobby continued around him. Transactions were processed. Customers came and went. The morning light shifted slightly as clouds moved outside the glass front of the building. And Jacob Turner sat in his worn jacket in a chair along the far wall of a bank that he owned in a branch that bore his company's name above the entrance. And he waited, and he watched, and he began to understand exactly what kind of problem he was dealing with. It was worse than the paperwork had suggested. It almost always was. He had been sitting in that chair for close to 40 minutes when the pattern finally broke, not because the branch improved, but because it got worse. An older man came through the front entrance, moving slowly, the kind of slowness that comes from joints that have logged too many years of physical work. He wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into dark trousers, and he carried a folded piece of paper in one hand, the kind of paper people carry when they've written something down, because they're afraid they'll forget it if they don't. He took a number from the dispenser and joined the line at the nearest open window, which happened to be Lauren's. Jacob watched him from across the room without making it obvious that he was watching. The older man's name, Jacob would learn later, was Walter Briggs. He was 68, recently retired from 30 years in the trades, and he had come to the branch that morning to sort out a direct deposit issue that had been delaying his pension payments for the better part of 6 weeks. He had called the phone line twice and been transferred and disconnected both times. This visit was his third attempt to resolve something that should have taken 15 minutes. Lauren looked at Walter the same way she had looked at Jacob, a single sweep, head to toe, that took less than 2 seconds, and concluded everything she needed to know. When Walter reached the window and unfolded his piece of paper to explain the situation, Lauren's expression settled into the particular blankness of someone performing the minimum required to be technically present in a conversation. She interrupted him twice. The first time to ask for identification before he'd finished his first sentence. The second time to tell him that pension deposit issues were handled by a different department and that he would need to call a number, the same phone number it turned out that had transferred and disconnected him twice before. When Walter mentioned this, Lauren said without any particular interest that she couldn't help with what had happened on previous calls. Walter tried once more to explain. He placed the folded paper on the counter and pointed to the relevant line. The account number, the deposit reference, the 6-week gap in payments. Lauren glanced at the paper. She did not pick it up. "Sir, there's nothing I can do at this window," she said. "You'll need to contact the pension services line." What Lauren said next was quieter than the remark she had made to Jacob earlier, but it carried the same architecture of contempt. She leaned slightly toward the teller beside her, a younger woman named Cassie, and said something in a lowered voice while gesturing briefly in Walter's direction. Cassie made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but close enough to one. Walter heard it. He looked down at his piece of paper and began to fold it back along its crease slowly, with the careful movements of a man absorbing something he had not been expecting to feel that morning. Jacob was already standing up before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. He crossed the lobby in measured steps and came to stand beside Walter at the window. Lauren saw him coming and recognized him from earlier. Something shifted behind her eyes, not quite alarm, but attention. "This gentleman has been trying to resolve this matter for 6 weeks, Jacob said, addressing Lauren directly, keeping his voice at a normal conversational volume. "He's contacted the phone line twice. He's here in person now. The account information is on that paper. What is the actual process for getting this escalated internally?" Lauren's expression reassembled itself into something professionally flat. "I understand your concern, but I was just explaining to him that this is handled by a separate department. There's a process we have to follow." "The process transferred him twice and disconnected him both times," Jacob said. "So I'm asking what the escalation path is when the standard process fails. Who in this branch has the authority to flag this directly?" The exchange had drawn attention. A few customers in the waiting area were watching now. Lauren was aware of this. Her posture shifted slightly, taking on the particular stiffness of someone who was performing for 2 audiences at once. "If you have a concern about how we handle our customers," Lauren said, and the word we came out with a slight emphasis that was intended to remind him he was not one of them. "You're welcome to submit a written complaint." Walter touched Jacob's arm lightly. "It's all right. I'll figure it out." His voice was quiet and carried no bitterness, which somehow made it worse than if it had. Jacob did not move. He looked at Lauren for a moment, then asked again clearly, and without raising his voice, to speak with the branch manager. This time, Lauren didn't say she would leave a note. She picked up the desk phone, made a brief call, and said with the composure of someone who believed they held every advantage in the room that the manager would be out shortly. Rebecca Collins emerged from the corridor behind the teller windows 2 minutes later. She was dressed precisely, her expression arranged in the practiced warmth of a manager who had learned to deploy warmth as a management tool rather than a genuine response. She looked at Jacob first, then at Walter, and then at Lauren, and in that sequence of looks, Jacob could read the entire structure of the branch's internal hierarchy. "I understand there's a concern," Rebecca said, addressing the space between Jacob and Walter rather than either of them directly. Jacob explained the situation, Walter's 6-week gap, the failed phone escalations, the lack of any resolution path being offered at the window. He kept it factual, kept it brief. Rebecca listened with the expression of someone waiting for the part that would require her to actually do something. When he finished, Rebecca said that the branch followed the standard process for pension deposit issues, and that unfortunately, there were limitations on what could be done at the branch level for certain account types. She then added in a tone that was almost gentle that she understood it was frustrating, but that these processes existed for good reasons. "What I'm asking," Jacob said, "is whether there's any mechanism within this branch to flag a case like this for priority review, not to bypass the process, but to ensure it actually moves forward rather than cycling through the same loop." Rebecca looked at him with an expression that was beginning to harden beneath its surface warmth. "I think what might be most helpful is if your friend contacts the pension services line and asks specifically to speak with a supervisor. That's the appropriate channel." "That channel disconnected him twice," Jacob said. "I understand that," Rebecca said. "And I'm sorry about that experience. But I have to ask that you let us handle our customers without interference." The word interference landed the way she intended it, to a reclassification of what he was doing from advocacy to disruption. Jacob looked at her steadily. "I'm a customer of this bank. So is he. I'm asking a reasonable question about what resources this branch offers when standard channels fail." Rebecca's expression completed its shift. The warmth was fully gone, now replaced by the particular manner of someone who had decided to stop pretending this was a collaborative conversation. "Security can assist you if you're having trouble understanding where to direct your concerns," she said. The security guard near the entrance had already taken a few steps toward the center of the room. He wasn't moving quickly. This wasn't an emergency in his assessment, but he was moving. Walter put a hand on Jacob's arm again. "Son, leave it." His voice was the same as before, quiet without bitterness, carrying only the specific exhaustion of someone who had decided long ago that some walls were not worth running into more than once. Jacob looked at Walter. Something in that expression, the particular way Walter had already begun to fold himself inward, preparing to walk out of this building and absorb yet another failure, settled something in Jacob that had still been adjustable until that moment. He was done observing. He had seen enough. He turned back to Rebecca. "I'd like to submit a formal complaint. I'd also like the name of the regional oversight contact for this branch." Rebecca told him the complaint process was available on the bank's website. She did not provide a regional contact name. She gestured briefly, but clearly toward the exit. Jacob left. Walter left beside him, and they stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the glass-fronted entrance in the mid-morning light, with the Chicago wind moving between the buildings. Walter said he appreciated what Jacob had tried to do. Jacob told him he was sorry it hadn't moved faster. He asked Walter if he would be willing to have his case documented, not in a way that required anything of Walter, immediately just that it existed on record. Walter looked at him for a moment, with the careful attention of someone assessing whether a stranger's offer was what it appeared to be. Then he said, yes, he supposed that would be all right. Jacob wrote down Walter's contact information in a note on his phone. Then they parted, and Jacob stood alone on the sidewalk for a moment, before moving toward the corner. He took out his phone and called David Harmon. Harmon picked up on the second ring. He already had the first layer of documentation running from Jacob's earlier message, and he said so before Jacob had finished his second sentence. Jacob gave him the full picture in under 3 minutes. The lobby dynamics, Lauren's conduct, Rebecca's response, Walter's case, the pattern of complaint filings from the branch's own records that had been closed without resolution. He told Harmon he wanted the full internal audit of this branch's service records for the past 3 years, with specific attention to complaint closure rates and the demographic data attached to unresolved filings. He wanted the legal team looped in. He wanted the board's audit committee notified, not as an emergency, but as a matter of governance. Harmon asked how quickly Jacob needed this moved. Jacob said he wanted the team ready to convene by end of week. He wanted documentation of everything that could be documented before then. He told Harmon to keep it quiet. No announcement to regional management. No signal to the branch. After he ended the call, Jacob stood at the corner for a moment with the phone in his hand. The glass front of the branch was visible from where he stood. Through it, he could see the lobby continuing, customers moving through transactions being processed. Lauren back at her window, with the same composed expression she had worn all morning. None of them knew. Rebecca didn't know. Lauren didn't know. The security guard who had walked a few steps toward the center of the room didn't know. What Jacob had set in motion in the last 3 minutes would within 72 hours involve 12 people across 4 departments, 3 external documentation specialists, and a formal audit request that would pull every service record this branch had generated in 36 months. The quiet efficiency of that process, invisible from the street, invisible from inside that lobby, was the actual distance between Jacob Turner, in his worn jacket, and the man Lauren Parker had decided she was looking at when she glanced across her window that morning. He was not angry. Anger was too simple for what this was. What he felt was something colder and more precise, the recognition that the problem inside that branch was not an accident, and it was not the result of one person's bad character. It was the result of a system that had been allowed to drift year by year, small decision by small decision, into something that treated certain people as if their time and their dignity were worth less than others. And that kind of drift didn't reverse itself because someone got embarrassed. It reversed because someone rebuilt the structure from the inside. Jacob put his phone in his pocket and began walking. He had 4 blocks to cover before he reached the parking structure where he'd left his car. The wind off the lake had picked up, and he turned the collar of his jacket up against it, the same jacket, and kept walking. Behind him through the glass, the lobby of the Meridian branch on North Michigan Avenue looked exactly the same as it always had. That was about to stop being true, and nobody inside knew it yet. The audit team worked quietly the way Jacob had asked them to. David Harmon coordinated from the corporate office on the 44th floor of a building 12 blocks north of the Meridian branch, pulling files that the branch staff had no visibility into. Internal complaint logs, service interaction records, processing time, differentials across customer segments, and 3 years of closure data on formally submitted grievances. What the data showed assembled together for the first time, rather than reviewed in isolated quarterly snapshots, was not subtle. The branch had received 114 formal service complaints over 36 months. 89 of them had been closed within 72 hours of filing, with a notation of resolved attached to each record. When Harmon's team cross-referenced those closures against any documented follow-up or customer confirmation, they found that fewer than 1 in 5 had any evidence of actual resolution. The rest had simply been marked closed and filed away. The legal team flagged this immediately. Complaint closure without resolution documentation was a compliance exposure, and at the volume this branch had generated, it moved from administrative sloppiness into territory that required board-level attention. Harmon notified the audit committee on Thursday evening, 48 hours after Jacob's call from the sidewalk on North Michigan Avenue. The committee authorized a formal internal review. By Friday morning, the documentation team had completed its initial file pull. By Friday afternoon, a meeting had been scheduled. None of this was communicated to the branch. Rebecca Collins spent that Thursday and Friday running the branch the same way she always had. She had processed Jacob's visit in the category of difficult customer, someone who had come in without an appointment, caused a scene, and been appropriately redirected. She had mentioned it briefly to Lauren, who had agreed that some people simply weren't worth the energy, and that had been the end of it. Neither of them gave it further thought. Lauren, for her part, had moved through the rest of the week with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had not been corrected. The interaction with Jacob had not troubled her, because in her version of events, she had handled it correctly. She had maintained professional boundaries with a walk-in who had become disruptive, and the manager had backed her up. That was how it was supposed to work. She told Cassie about it during their lunch break on Thursday, framing it lightly, as a minor story about the kinds of people you had to deal with in customer-facing work. Cassie laughed in the places Lauren expected her to laugh. She did not say the thing she had almost said twice during the retelling, that the older man with the pension issue had looked genuinely defeated when he'd walked away from the window, and that she had not felt good about that part. Jacob returned to the branch on Friday afternoon. He came in the same jacket at the same unhurried pace and took a number from the dispenser near the entrance. The lobby was quieter than it had been Thursday morning, late Friday traffic, the particular stillness of a business week winding down. He sat in the same row of gray chairs along the far wall and waited. Lauren saw him from her window the moment he sat down. Her expression registered something recognition and something adjacent to irritation before settling back into its default, professional arrangement. She did not acknowledge him. He did not look at her. He waited for 22 minutes without being called, despite the number system showing 3 customers ahead of him having already been served. When a 4th customer who had arrived after Jacob was directed to an open window before him, Jacob stood and walked to the service desk near the entrance, where a junior staff member named Tyler was managing the flow. Jacob pointed out without any particular emphasis that his number had been passed twice. Tyler looked at the system, looked at Jacob, and said there must have been a mix-up. He would get Jacob to a window shortly. His tone suggested he was not especially concerned about the mix-up. Jacob returned to his chair. He was not called for another 11 minutes. When he finally reached a window, not Lauren's, but the one adjacent to it, staffed by a teller named Marcus, who had the slightly distracted air of someone counting hours until the weekend, Jacob requested once more to speak with the branch manager regarding a service concern. Marcus asked if he had submitted a complaint through the website. Jacob said he preferred to speak with the manager directly. Marcus said he would check on her availability. Rebecca appeared 4 minutes later. She recognized Jacob immediately, and the recognition did not improve her expression. She came to stand at the window beside Marcus and looked at Jacob with the flattened patience of someone who had decided in advance that this conversation would not last long. "I'm going to need to ask you to submit any concerns through our formal complaint channel," she said, before Jacob had spoken. "We've already discussed your issues from Thursday, and there's nothing further I can add at this branch level." Jacob looked at her calmly. "I came back because I wanted to give you the opportunity to address this directly before it moves to a different level," he said. Rebecca's expression didn't shift. "I appreciate that. Our complaint process exists precisely for situations like this. If you'd like, Tyler at the service desk can walk you through the submission steps." She turned to go. Lauren at the adjacent window had been watching the exchange with the sideways attention of someone who was pretending not to watch. When Rebecca turned, Lauren's expression settled into something that was almost a smile. The private satisfaction of someone watching a problem be handled the way they would have handled it. "I think you may want to reconsider that," Jacob said. Rebecca turned back. Her voice, when she responded, had acquired the particular edge of someone who had run out of patience and was no longer trying to conceal it. "Sir, I've been very clear about what we can and cannot offer you here. If you continue to disrupt branch operations, I will have to ask security to assist you out of the building. I'd prefer not to do that, but I will if necessary." The lobby was quiet enough that several people heard this. A woman in a winter coat near the waiting area looked up from her phone. A man at the far window glanced over. The security guard near the entrance straightened slightly. Lauren said, just loud enough to carry, "Some people just don't get the message." She was speaking toward Cassie, but she was not speaking quietly. Jacob looked at Lauren. Then he looked at Rebecca. Then he looked at the room, the customers who had heard the staff who had said nothing, the security guard who was beginning his slow walk toward the center of the lobby. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a speech. He made a call. Harmon picked up on the first ring. Jacob said 4 words. "We're ready. Come now." Then he put the phone back in his pocket and stood where he was in the middle of the lobby, while Rebecca told the security guard to escort him out. The guard, a broad-shouldered man named Greg, who had worked this branch for 2 years and had escorted perhaps a dozen people to the exit. In that time, came to stand beside Jacob and said, in the professionally neutral tone he used for these situations, that he was going to need Jacob to come with him. Jacob said, "Give it about 4 minutes." Greg looked at him. Something in the way Jacob said it, not aggressive, not pleading, just completely level, made Greg slow down without entirely stopping. He said he didn't want to make this uncomfortable. "It won't be," Jacob said. 4 minutes, Rebecca, standing at the window, said. "Greg, please." Her voice had the sharpness of someone who needed the situation resolved before it became anything else. Greg took Jacob by the arm gently, but with clear direction, and began walking him toward the entrance. Jacob went without resistance. Lauren watched from her window. Her expression had completed its journey to open satisfaction, the look of someone watching an outcome they had decided was correct. They were 6 feet from the entrance doors when the doors opened from the outside. 4 people came in, moving with the particular purposefulness of people who knew exactly where they were going and had not come to wait. The one at the front was a woman named Sandra Okafor, the company's chief audit officer. She held a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone who had already read every document she needed to read and was now here to do what the documents required. Beside her was the company's general counsel, a man named Richard Forsyth, who had been with the organization for 16 years. Behind them were 2 members of the board's audit committee, both of whom had flown in from the regional headquarters that morning. Sandra looked at Greg. She looked at Jacob. She said calmly, "Please release him." Greg let go of Jacob's arm and took a step back. The lobby had gone completely still. Rebecca at the window was looking at the 4 people who had just walked through the door with an expression that was working very hard to remain composed and not entirely succeeding. Sandra addressed the room not loudly, but in the tone of someone making a statement that would not need to be repeated. "We're conducting a formal internal review of this branch's operations. All transactions are being temporarily suspended while we convene a meeting with branch management and staff. Customers will be assisted in rescheduling or completing urgent transactions through our central services team." She turned to Rebecca. "Ms. Collins, we'll need the conference room, now." Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at Jacob, really looked at him for the first time with the recognition that something had shifted in the landscape in a way she didn't yet have the coordinates for. She looked at the 4 people standing inside her branch entrance. She looked back at Jacob. Lauren at her window had stopped moving entirely. The satisfaction that had been on her face 4 minutes ago had been replaced by something that hadn't had time to become a specific expression, yet hovering between confusion and the first cold awareness that she had misread something significant. Jacob walked past Greg, past the service desk, past the row of gray chairs where he had sat for 40 minutes the previous morning, and into the conference corridor that led off the back of the lobby. Sandra fell into step beside him. Richard Forsyth followed. The 2 board members came behind them. Rebecca followed last, moving through the door with the careful step of someone who was beginning to understand that the room she was walking into was not the same room it had appeared to be from the outside. Behind them, the lobby remained frozen for a moment. Staff at their windows, customers in chairs, Greg standing near the entrance with his hands at his sides, and then slowly the particular silence of something irreversible began to settle over everything, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Cassie at her window looked at Lauren. Lauren was still looking at the corridor door that had closed behind the group. Her face had finally settled into an expression. It was not one she would have chosen. The branch had been operating for 4 years, under the assumption that what happened inside it stayed inside it, that the distance between the lobby and wherever decisions were actually made was wide enough to provide cover for the small, consistent cruelties that had become its daily texture. That assumption had just been removed. The lobby knew it. The staff knew it. And in the conference room at the end of that corridor, the conversation that was about to happen would make it permanent. The conference room at the back of the Meridian branch was a functional space, a rectangular table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard along one wall, a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. It had been used for staff meetings and quarterly reviews, and the occasional difficult conversation between Rebecca and an underperforming employee. It had never been used for anything like this. Jacob sat at one end of the table. Sandra Okafor sat to his left, her portfolio open in front of her. Richard Forsyth sat across from her, a tablet on the table beside a printed summary that ran to 11 pages. The 2 board members, a man named Howard Pell and a woman named Diane Garrett, sat together on one side, quiet, in the way that people are quiet when they have already formed their conclusions and are present mainly to confirm them. Rebecca Collins sat at the far end of the table. She had not been offered the option of bringing anyone with her. Rebecca still did not know exactly who Jacob was. She had understood by now that the 4 people who had walked through the door were not regulars, and that whatever was happening was not a routine customer escalation. But the full picture had not yet been given to her, and the not knowing was doing visible work on her composure. Sandra opened the review. She walked through the documentation methodically, the complaint closure data, the processing differential records, the pattern of unresolved filings that had been marked, resolved without evidence of follow-through. She presented the numbers without editorializing. 114 complaints, 89 closures with no resolution trail, a demographic pattern in the unresolved cases that was consistent enough to constitute a systemic finding rather than an anomaly. As Sandra spoke, Richard periodically highlighted a line on the printed summary, and Howard Pell made a note in the margin of his copy, and Diane Garrett looked at Rebecca with the steady attention of someone taking a precise measurement. Rebecca said twice that she had always run the branch according to the guidelines she had been given. The first time she said it, Sandra acknowledged the statement and continued. The second time, Sandra put her pen down and looked at Rebecca directly and said that the question before them was not whether guidelines had been followed in the formal sense, but what had been permitted to develop in the space between the guidelines, what the culture of this branch had become, and how long it had been that way, and who had allowed it. Rebecca did not have an answer for that which was different from the first 2 answers she had given. Then Jacob spoke. He had been quiet through Sandra's presentation, sitting at the end of the table, with his hands flat on the surface, watching Rebecca's face, the way he had watched the lobby the previous morning, not to catch her in something, but to understand what he was looking at. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been at Lauren's window level, unhurried, giving nothing away before he was ready to give it. He told Rebecca who he was, not as a revelation designed to humiliate her without theater, without the satisfaction that the moment might have offered if he had been a different kind of person. He told her because the record required it, and because the conversation that followed needed to happen on accurate terms. He was the owner of the Meridian Financial Group, the parent corporation of the bank, whose name appeared above the entrance of this branch. He had come to this branch 2 days ago as an ordinary customer, because the branch's own internal records had raised concerns he wanted to assess firsthand. What he had observed during those 2 days had confirmed and exceeded those concerns. Rebecca's face moved through several things in the space of about 4 seconds. Jacob continued. He told her that he had not come to the branch looking for a reason to take action against individuals. He had come because a pattern in the data suggested a systemic problem, and systemic problems required direct observation to understand. What he had found was not a matter of one employee's poor judgment on a single morning. What he had found was a branch-wide culture that had sorted its customers by appearance and treated their requests accordingly, that had built complaint suppression into its administrative routine, that had allowed its staff to model contempt toward certain customers, and rewarded that conduct with silence and advancement. That culture had grown in this branch over 4 years. It had not grown without permission. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Richard Forsythe outlined the immediate steps. Rebecca Collins and Lauren Parker were suspended with immediate effect, pending the conclusion of the formal review. The suspension covered all other supervisory staff who had been identified in the documentation as having oversight responsibility during the period in question. An external HR firm would conduct interviews with branch staff over the following 2 weeks. Customers whose complaint records showed unresolved closures would be contacted individually, beginning with Walter Briggs, whose pension deposit case would be escalated to the appropriate department that afternoon, with a direct flag for priority resolution. When Richard finished, Howard Pell said simply that the board expected a full remediation plan within 30 days. Rebecca left the conference room without saying anything further. She walked through the lobby with the particular stillness of someone who had gone past the point where expression was available to them. Lauren was no longer at her window. She had been asked to step away when the review began, and she was waiting in the break room with the same awareness that the lobby had carried since Sandra's announcement that something had already been decided, and that the lobby's version of normal was not coming back. What followed over the next several weeks moved quietly but completely. The external review produced a full accounting of the branch's service culture interviews, with 14 staff members, review of 3 years of internal communications, and a reconstruction of how the sorting behavior had developed and been reinforced over time. The findings were not flattering to anyone who had been in a position of oversight at the branch. Jacob read every page of the report. He did not enjoy it. He had built this organization over a long time and had believed without adequate verification that the values he intended it to carry had actually taken root throughout it. The report told him they hadn't, not here, not in this branch, and possibly not in other places he had not yet looked. That was the harder finding, and he sat with it, the way he sat with most things that required sitting with, quietly, without looking away from it. The remediation plan he signed off on did not stop at this branch. It included a full review of complaint closure practices across all locations, the implementation of independent customer feedback audits conducted by an external firm on a rotating basis, and mandatory service culture training that would be developed not by internal HR, but by an outside group that specialized in identifying institutional bias in customer-facing environments. It included a compensation process for customers whose cases had been improperly closed, administered by a dedicated team that reported directly to the board rather than to branch management. Walter Briggs received a direct call from the corporate office on the Monday following the review. His pension deposit issue was resolved within 48 hours. He was also informed that his case had been a factor in the formal investigation, and that the organization was grateful he had attempted to resolve it through the branch, even though the branch had failed him 3 times. Walter, Jacob was told, had said that he appreciated the call, but that what would matter most to him was whether the next person who walked into that branch with a folded piece of paper got treated like a human being. The person who relayed this to Jacob said it almost as an afterthought. Jacob wrote it down. 4 months after the review, on a Thursday morning in early spring, when the light through the glass front of the building fell differently than it had in winter, Jacob Turner walked back into the Meridian branch on North Michigan Avenue. He wore the same jacket. He took a number from the dispenser and sat in a chair along the far wall. The teller who called his number when his turn came was a young woman he had not seen before. She greeted him with the same manner she had used with the 3 customers before him, straightforward, attentive, without the performance of warmth that was really its opposite. She asked how she could help. He told her he had a question about an account. She pulled up the record, answered the question, and asked if there was anything else he needed. There wasn't. He thanked her and walked out into the spring morning. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment outside the glass front of the building and looked back through it at the lobby, the marble floor, the gray chairs, the teller windows where people were being helped. The branch looked the same as it always had from the outside. From the inside, it was different. He had been in enough places, built enough things to know the difference between a room that was performing a value and a room that had actually absorbed one. What he had seen in the past 10 minutes was the second kind. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't stay perfect without continued attention. But it was real, and it had not come from anyone's fear of consequence. It had come from a deliberate rebuilding of what the branch understood its job to be. Claire had believed that the moment you stopped being able to imagine what it felt like to need something, you lost the most important thing a person in their position could have. Jacob thought she would have found what he saw through that window this morning to be a reasonable start. He put his hands in the pockets of his jacket and walked toward the corner into the ordinary light of an ordinary Thursday in Chicago, and he didn't look back.